Deer Lodge, Montana Territory, 1886. There's a particular kind of quiet that surrounds a man the whole town has quietly decided to leave alone, not out of unkindness, but out of the plain accumulated habit of respecting a solitude a person seems to genuinely want. And Obadiah Quinn had lived inside that particular quiet for the better part of 8 years by the time I first noticed him properly. He was 58 years old, the town's gunsmith, a trade he had taken up after his soldiering years ended, and he lived alone at the edge of Deer Lodge in a modest cabin behind his small workshop, tall and lean still despite his years, his hair and beard gone fully gray, his hands steady and precise in the particular way of a man whose whole trade depended on exactness. He had served through the war years back east before coming west, a chapter of his life he rarely discussed, and had settled in Deer Lodge afterward, married briefly, and been widowed early enough that most of the town had nearly forgotten he had ever been married at all. His days ran early and orderly, the shop opened promptly each morning, each customer's work attended to with the same unhurried precision, regardless of how simple or complicated the repair. Evenings spent alone over whatever plain supper he managed for himself before an early bed, a schedule so steady the town had long since stopped remarking on it. I am Delphine Ashworth, and I had grown up in Deer Lodge, the daughter of the town's baker, learning the trade at my father's side from the time I was old enough to properly knead dough, and had taken over the bakery entirely 3 years back when his own hands grew too unsteady for the precise work the trade demanded. I was 26 years old, and I had spent those 3 years building a modest, steady reputation for good, honest bread, work I took genuine pride in, though it left precious little time for much beyond the bakery's early hours and long days. My own mornings began well before dawn, the first loaves needing their proper time in the oven before the town properly woke, and my evenings generally ended with account books in preparation for the following day, a rhythm that had, without my particularly noticing the accumulation of it, left little room for much beyond the bakery's steady demands. Deer Lodge sat along a wide valley floor between two mountain ranges, a modest but steadily growing town with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and Obadiah's gunsmith shop standing at the quiet southern edge of Main Street, set apart just enough from the town's regular commotion that it seemed to suit the particular solitude of the man who ran it. The town had long since settled into treating Obadiah's isolation as simply a permanent fact about him, the way one accepted a hard winter or a stubborn mule, something to be respected rather than questioned. And I had grown up alongside that same settled assumption without ever much examining it myself. My own father had known Obadiah slightly over the years, the two of them exchanging polite nods and brief practical conversation whenever their paths crossed at the mercantile. But even my father, who generally knew everybody in Deer Lodge at least passably well, admitted he had never managed more than surface acquaintance with the reserved gunsmith, a fact that had always struck me, growing up, as simply another unremarkable feature of the town's settled landscape. My mother, before she died when I was 14, used to tell me that bread left warm on somebody's doorstep said things a person's mouth sometimes could not properly manage, that the whole art of good baking was really an art of care disguised as simple nourishment, and I had carried that instruction into my own trade more than I had ever fully realized until the particular events of that autumn taught me exactly how true it was. It began, as such things generally do, without much deliberate planning on my part whatsoever. Obadiah had been a long-time customer at the bakery, coming in once weekly for a single loaf, always polite, always brief, never lingering beyond the necessary transaction. And it was in September that I happened to overhear, from Mrs. Agatha Pruitt at the mercantile, that Obadiah had been laid up for the better part of a week with a bad chest cold, unable to properly manage his own cooking, and had been seen looking considerably thinner than his usual lean frame generally allowed. I do not know exactly what prompted me to act on that small piece of gossip, rather than simply noting it and moving along with my own busy week, except perhaps my mother's old instructions settling in me more firmly than I had properly expected. But that Friday, after closing the bakery, I found myself wrapping a fresh loaf, still warm from the oven, in a clean cloth, and walking it the length of Main Street to leave on Obadiah's porch, without knocking, without announcing myself, simply setting it down and walking home again before I could talk myself out of the small, admittedly forward gesture. I did not hear anything about it for the better part of a week, and had nearly convinced myself the whole errand had gone unnoticed or unappreciated, until the following Friday, closing the bakery at my usual hour, I found Obadiah himself waiting near the door, looking faintly uncertain in a way I had not previously associated with him. "I believe I owe you a proper thank you," he said by way of greeting, "for the bread." It was nothing, I said, though I felt my own face warm slightly at being caught in the act of the small gesture rather than simply leaving it anonymous. "It was considerably more than nothing to a man eating poorly through a bad chest cold," he said. "I would like to properly repay the kindness, if you will allow it." "You do not owe me anything," I said. "I was glad to do it." That should have been the whole of it. A small neighborly kindness extended and acknowledged, the kind of ordinary decency Deer Lodge generally practiced toward any struggling neighbor without much further thought. Except that the following Friday, having genuinely enjoyed the bread, and, I suspected though he did not say so directly, having genuinely appreciated simply being thought of, I found myself wrapping another loaf and walking it down to his porch again, and the Friday after that, until the gesture had become, without either of us particularly planning it, a settled weekly ritual. "I know I did not have to keep doing this," I told him the third or fourth Friday, when he caught me at the porch rather than finding the bread already left. "I know," he said. Seemed a foolish thing to stop something that seemed to genuinely help once I had started it. Obadiah, in turn, began noticing small things about my own circumstances that I had never mentioned to him directly. The fact that the bakery's delivery cart had a wheel that pulled hard to one side, making my early morning deliveries considerably more difficult than they needed to be. And he appeared at the bakery one morning before I had even opened, having quietly repaired the wheel himself sometime in the pre-dawn hours, gone again before I discovered the work. "You did not have to do that," I told him, "the morning I found the cart rolling true for the first time in months." "I know," he said, echoing my own words back at me with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Seemed a foolish thing to let a hard-working woman struggle with a bad wheel when I had the tools and the early hours to spare." It was in October that I mentioned, in passing conversation at the Mercantile, that the bakery's back door had begun sticking badly with the season's first proper dampness, forcing me to shoulder it open every morning before I could even begin my work. Obadiah, hearing of it within the day the way most small things eventually traveled through a town this size, appeared before dawn the following morning with a plain and a proper set of tools, shaving the door down and rehanging it true before I had even arrived to open the bakery myself, gone again before I could catch him at the work. "You did not have to fix that door either," I told him the following Friday, setting the bread down between us, though I had already suspected, walking over, exactly whose careful work I would find waiting. "I know," he said. Seemed a foolish thing to let a sticking door slow down a woman who was already up before the sun most mornings. He kept an old gray-muzzled hound named Cassius, who had accompanied him faithfully through what I gathered were his soldiering years, and had settled into a comfortable, dignified old age at the gunsmith shop. And Cassius took to greeting my Friday deliveries with a warmth that surprised even Obadiah, the old dog rising stiffly from his usual spot by the shop door the moment my particular footsteps approached down Main Street, as though the animal had long since decided something the two humans involved were still working out for themselves. The town noticed, as small towns invariably do. Mrs. Pruitt remarked at the Mercantile that the baker's daughter seemed to be paying an unusual amount of attention to old Obadiah Quinn these days, and old Ezekiel Feathers, who ran the livery and had known Obadiah since his arrival in Deer Lodge decades prior, observed that Obadiah had taken to keeping his shop considerably tidier than his usual practical standards generally required, a small vanity nobody had previously associated with the gunsmith. I told myself I was simply extending ordinary neighborly kindness, the plain decent practice my own mother had taught me to value long before I properly understood what it might eventually grow into. Obadiah, I later learned, told himself he was merely being appropriately grateful for unexpected generosity, nothing more complicated than good manners. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, though, at the time, Neither of us examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both of us had reasons to leave carefully alone. My own fear, when I finally sat with it honestly one evening after a long week at the bakery, wore a shape that felt almost too foolish to properly name. I was 26 years old, and Obadiah Quinn was 32 years my senior, a settled, solitary man the whole town had long since stopped expecting anything further from, and I told myself, turning the matter over with the same careful attention I brought to a difficult recipe, that whatever warmth had grown between us through our small weekly exchange belonged strictly to the category of pleasant, ordinary friendship, that a woman my age entertaining any further thoughts about a man old enough to be my father was precisely the kind of foolishness Deer Lodge would find considerably more amusing than sympathetic, the sort of gossip that would follow me at the mercantile counter for months, regardless of how the matter eventually resolved itself. I filed the matter into the safest available category and told myself firmly that the category would hold, even as it grew steadily less convincing. With every Friday, I found myself anticipating well before the actual walk to his porch. Obadiah's own fear, I came to understand much later, wore an older, more weathered shape. He had spent 8 years building a settled, solitary existence, specifically because his own soldiering years and his brief, difficult marriage had taught him, he believed, that he was not particularly suited to close attachment, that something in his own nature made him better company for himself than for anybody else, a conclusion he had reached slowly and reluctantly, rather than arriving at it easily. To let himself want the warm, generous attention of a young woman not yet 30 felt, to him, like courting a disappointment he had no particular confidence in his own ability to properly prevent. He told himself, therefore, that what he felt toward me was simple gratitude for unexpected kindness, nothing more, and kept his own manner carefully measured even as our Friday ritual grew, week over week, into something considerably harder to keep so simply categorized. It was around this time that a perfectly amiable young rancher named Bartholomew Reese began finding regular excuses to linger at the bakery counter, purchasing more bread than any bachelor reasonably required, and working, with increasing obviousness, toward a formal invitation to walk me to the autumn social, a courtship Mrs. Pruitt observed with evident approval, certain that a respectable young rancher represented precisely the match a baker's daughter ought to welcome. Bartholomew was pleasant enough company, steady in his own quiet way, and had inherited a modest but respectable spread from his own father, exactly the sort of practical, age-appropriate prospect Mrs. Pruitt made a point of mentioning approvingly whenever the subject arose at the mercantile counter, generally within earshot of anybody willing to listen. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a woman who has spent weeks insisting her feelings were only ordinary friendship has to watch a more conventional, age-appropriate suitor step forward with every practical advantage on his side. I had spent weeks telling myself that what I felt for Obadiah was simple neighborly warmth. I was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost me, watching it nearly hand my whole attention to a perfectly pleasant man I felt considerably less for than I felt for the quiet gunsmith at the edge of town. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are listening from, whether that is somewhere here in the United States, up across the border in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have found its way to. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales travel. Now, let us get back to Deer Lodge, because I am about to learn something about my own stubborn heart that Obadiah Quinn already seemed to understand. I accepted Bartholomew Reese's invitation to the autumn social, telling myself repeatedly that it was exactly the sensible choice a practical young woman ought to make, and told myself this with such determined frequency that I very nearly believed it, right up until the evening itself, standing in front of my own small mirror preparing for the social, when I found myself thinking, without particularly meaning to, of Obadiah's careful, precise hands rather than anything Bartholomew might say to me over punch and conversation, right up until the Friday before the social itself, walking my usual loaf down to Obadiah's porch. when he met me there, rather than finding the bread already left, and mentioned carefully that he had heard I was attending the social with young Bartholomew. "Word travels fast in this town," I said, setting the bread down between us. "It generally does," he said. "I expect he is a perfectly decent young man." "He is," I said. "I do not feel about him the way I feel walking this bread down here every Friday, though." Obadiah was quiet a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not immediately read, the porch light catching the gray in his beard. "And how do you feel walking that bread down here every Friday?" he finally asked. "Considerably more than ordinary friendship generally accounts for," I said, plain, having decided somewhere in the walk over that plainness was the only honest option remaining to me, my hands still faintly trembling from the effort of finally saying it aloud. I've spent weeks telling myself otherwise, and I'm rather tired of pretending. He was quiet another long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was something dry and careful in it, the same tone he had used that very first evening he thanked me for the bread. "An old man might take this for courting," he said, half a joke, though I heard underneath it something considerably more serious asking to be properly answered. "Is that a joke?" I asked, "or an actual question?" "Both," he admitted. "I'm 58 years old, Delphine, 32 years your senior. I've spent 8 years believing myself poorly suited to anybody's close company, and I do not entirely trust my own judgment on whether wanting yours, as thoroughly as I apparently do, is wisdom or simple foolishness dressed up in an old man's gray beard." "Then let me answer plainly, since you are asking," I said. "I've been leaving bread on this porch every single Friday for 2 months, Obadiah. I could have stopped any time the errand felt like simple charity. It has never once felt like simple charity. If that is not courting, I do not know a better word for what it actually is." The porch held very still, evening settling around the small gunsmith shop, somewhere nearby Cassius, shifting in his usual spot with a low, contented sigh. Obadiah looked at me a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter and more certain than his usual measured tone. "Then I suppose an old man ought to properly court you," he said, "if that is genuinely what this has become." "I suppose he ought to," I said, and Obadiah Quinn, 58 years old and certain until roughly that very conversation that close attachment was simply not a comfort life had properly suited him for, crossed the small distance of his own porch and kissed me, careful and certain both at once, while Cassius thumped his tail against the boards in what I chose, even then, to understand as clear approval. Word moved through Deer Lodge with predictable speed once our courtship became evident. Mrs. Pruitt declared she had suspected it since the wheel repair. Bartholomew Reese took the disappointment with reasonable grace, admitting to Mrs. Pruitt that he had sensed, these past weeks, that my attention had settled somewhere his own courtship could not properly compete with, and old Ezekiel Feathers claimed, with evident satisfaction, that he had known it the moment Obadiah started keeping his shop so unusually tidy. We married that following spring, in a small ceremony at the Deer Lodge Church with a fair portion of the town in attendance, curiosity about the town's longtime bachelor finally settling, drawing a crowd considerably larger than either of us had expected. I wore light blue rather than any traditional bridal white, having decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever genuinely suited her rather than whatever convention demanded, and Obadiah later told me I looked, standing at the front of that small church, exactly as striking as he had quietly believed. Since that first evening he properly thanked me for the bread, though he admitted, with characteristic dryness, that he had thought so considerably before he ever worked up the courage to properly say it. His hands, steady enough for decades of precise gunsmith work, trembled slightly, saying his vows, a fact I would tease him about gently for years afterward, and when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told me plainly that he had spent 8 years believing himself poorly suited to close attachment, and that I had proven, one warm Friday loaf at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own settled assessment of his own nature. Old Cassius, brought along at my specific insistence despite Reverend Whitlow's mild reservations about hounds in a church, spent the whole ceremony curled contentedly near the altar steps, a small, dignified witness nobody present thought worth the trouble of removing, though Reverend Whitlow mentioned afterward, with visible restraint, that he hoped the arrangement would not become a general expectation among his younger congregants in the years ahead. Our first year together settled into a rhythm neither of us had fully expected. My own bakery and his gunsmith trade, standing close enough together now that our 2 working days naturally overlapped, evenings shared rather than spent separately as they had been for so many years prior. He built me a proper new delivery cart that first spring, sturdier and better balanced than my old one, sized exactly to the routes I traveled most, because he had noticed, without my mentioning it twice, precisely what my growing business needed, framing the whole thing himself over several careful evenings once his own shop closed for the day, testing the balance repeatedly on the very street where I made my rounds until he was satisfied it rolled exactly true. My father, watching the 2 of us settle into our shared rhythm, remarked more than once that he had not seen the bakery run so smoothly since his own hands were steady enough to properly help me manage it, a compliment that touched me considerably more than he likely realized, coming as it did from a man who had spent his own later years quietly worrying, I later learned, whether I would ever properly let anyone close enough to share the considerable weight of running the bakery alone. Old Ezekiel Feathers took to remarking at the livery that the gunsmith shop had never kept such regular, cheerful hours in all his years, knowing Obadiah, a development he attributed, not incorrectly, entirely to my own influence on the previously solitary man. Mrs. Pruitt, for her part, declared to anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first Friday delivery exactly how the whole matter would eventually resolve itself, a claim that was not, strictly speaking, entirely true, but which nobody troubled to dispute, given how genuinely pleased she seemed by the actual outcome. The bakery's own customers noticed, too, several regulars remarking with evident approval that both the bread and the baker seemed considerably livelier since the previous autumn, an observation I generally accepted with more grace than embarrassment as the months passed. It was not without its harder moments. That following winter, Obadiah's old soldiering injury, a knee wound from his war years that had troubled him only occasionally through his younger years, began aching considerably worse in the deep cold, slowing his precise gunsmith work in ways that frustrated him more than he let show, some mornings requiring a full hour of careful movement before the joint loosened enough for the delicate work his trade demanded. I found myself, more than one long night, watching him work through simple tasks with visible discomfort, and turning over a fear I had never quite let myself name fully, that I had married a man whose old injuries might, in time, ask more of both of us than I had originally accounted for. Obadiah, noticing my troubled quiet, did not brush past it. He told me plainly that the knee would likely trouble him further with the years, that he could not promise an easy road through every cold season ahead, but that he would always tell me the truth of how he was faring, rather than hide it out of some misguided notion of sparing my worry. Sitting with me a long while that particular evening, simply talking through what the years ahead might actually require of us both. And I, hearing him choose honesty over false comfort, found the fear easing into something I could carry rather than something that carried me. By the following spring, he had taken on a young apprentice specifically to handle the heaviest, most physically demanding portions of the trade, a practical adjustment he made without complaint, once I gently pointed out that a stubborn knee rarely improved by being repeatedly tested against the shop's heaviest work. And I found, watching him train the young man patiently through his first uncertain months, that Obadiah possessed a genuine gift for teaching that his previously solitary years had never given him much occasion to properly discover in himself. 2 years passed, and on a bright September morning, almost exactly to the day since I had first heard of Obadiah's bad chest cold, I stood in the bakery doorway, our young daughter Grace, coppery-haired like myself, balanced on my hip and reaching toward the street with delighted, fearless hands, a fresh loaf already wrapped and waiting on the counter beside me for the walk down to his shop. The bakery itself had grown considerably since those early years, a second oven now humming steadily in the back room Obadiah had helped me expand, our combined enterprise having settled into the kind of quiet prosperity neither of us had quite anticipated when a single loaf of bread first crossed the distance between our two households, customers now traveling from neighboring valleys for bread that had, by then, earned a reputation stretching well beyond Deer Lodge's own modest borders. Still making that same Friday walk, he said, coming up the street for his midday visit, Cassius, considerably grayer now himself, trailing slowly behind him with the particular dignified patience of an old hound who had long since earned his leisurely pace. "I am," I said, smiling. "Old habits." "You know," he said, taking Grace into his own arms so I could properly close up the bakery counter, "I still think about that first Friday, standing in this very doorway, waiting to see whether you had noticed the bread or simply walked past it without a second thought, half convinced I had imagined the whole small kindness entirely." "I noticed it considerably more than a second thought's worth," I said. "I've been noticing it every Friday since. An old man still takes it for courting," he said, and meant it entirely. In every sense, a settled, once solitary man could mean such a thing. "And a baker's daughter still takes it for exactly that as well," I said, and we walked together down toward his shop, Grace babbling contentedly between us, the whole familiar length of Main Street settling into the particular golden light that September afternoons in Deer Lodge generally favored. I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often assume that love requires some dramatic, unmistakable announcement, a declaration bold enough that nobody involved could possibly mistake its meaning. But Obadiah Quinn's courtship of me and mine of him announced itself first as warm bread left quietly on a porch, a small, repeated act of simply thinking of somebody the rest of the world had settled into leaving alone. That is so often how the truest care actually begins, not as declaration but as ordinary, repeated attention, the plain decision to keep showing up for somebody's sake long after the original excuse for showing up has stopped being strictly necessary. There is a particular gentleness in a courtship that never once announces itself as such until both parties are ready to properly name it. Obadiah's joke about an old man taking a simple gesture for courting could have landed as deflection, a way of laughing off something he was not yet prepared to claim honestly. Instead, spoken with his own particular dry warmth, it became the very door through which we both finally walked, the joke itself doing the brave work neither of us had quite managed with plain speech alone. I'd spent 2 months telling myself that leaving bread on a lonely man's porch was simple neighborly kindness, nothing more complicated than good manners inherited from my own mother. I learned eventually that the kindness and the courting were never actually separate things at all, that genuine care, offered consistently enough and without any expectation of return, has a way of becoming something considerably more significant than either party initially intends. Sometimes the truest romance begins exactly where Obadiah's joke suggested it might, in an old man taking a young woman's simple, repeated kindness for exactly what it eventually, honestly became. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me and with Obadiah tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for us from that very first loaf left on the porch, or did it take you a little longer, the way it took me myself, to trust that this particular kind of steady attention was the real thing? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody takes your own small kindness for exactly what it is worth. Until next time, keep writing.